Right, so let's get started with our first lecture on the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, of course, I will be sending PDF files with all these notes so that you can go deeper into some of the things over which I will go pretty quickly because we haven't got much time. These are 2-hour lectures. We also have to have a look at text excerpts. So sometimes I have to be pretty quick about it. So please read those notes, go into the footnotes. They are sometimes really helpful. And generally speaking, use those documents for your revisions. In the notes, you will also find terms highlighted in yellow because not everything is of the same importance. These yellow highlights are for key dates, names, facts, that sort of thing. You will also find a number of notions in red, bold red. These are usually words or phrases with a definition you should really memorize because this might form the subject for 1 or 2 questions in the written exam at the end of the semester. But now, let's begin. British literature is used as the title for this unit to distinguish it from a second series of lectures on American literature in the second semester. But this is a misnomer. It should be called English literature because the starting point of our study is the English language. It's not the geographic notion of the British Isles, Britain and Ireland mainly. It's not the language and culture of the original inhabitants, the Celts, who in simplified terms spoke various shades of Brittonic and Latin, of course, after the Roman conquest, which had begun with Julius Caesar's first landing in 55 BC. Do remember, you've got a map here, do remember the Romans never went to Ireland and they stopped on their way up north. They stopped at Hadrian's Wall, and the farthest they might have gone was the Antonine Wall, but never above the Firth of Forth. Anyway, our real subject, English literature, began with an invasion, the so-called Adventus Saxonum, arrival of the Saxons in AD 449. It derives from the Germanic language spoken by the invaders, those Saxons. Now, this name itself is another misnomer, but it's still used today by the descendants of the Celts. In Scotland, the English are sometimes referred to as the Sassenach. If you were to publish a Welsh English dictionary, that would be a Saesneg Cymraeg dictionary, obviously. A more precise description is required, in fact. These invaders were 3 main strands. They were traditionally identified as the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. They were seafaring tribes coming from the shores of what is now Denmark and northwestern Germany. So you see, not really modern Saxony. They were led by semi-historical figures, the chiefs Hengist and Horsa. But since the Angles ended up giving their name to the language, English, and the land, England, England, a better option is to use the compound Anglo-Saxon. And this is what we are doing here today. This is the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, I have to go into more detail for you to really understand the situation. After the Romans left Britain around 410 AD, their empire crumbled, and the Celts were left in Britain, were left to their own devices and internal wars. They were Christianized, and that they kept the Christian religion, but they gradually suffered the same collapse of organized central state authority, education, and generally speaking, advanced civilization as the rest of Western Europe. The Pax Romana descended into the Dark Ages until around 800 AD, when a modicum of order began to be restored. Though modern historians prefer to talk about the early Middle Ages from the 5th to the 10th century AD, and they even challenge the notion of total chaos, the fact remains that only monks, having taken refuge in their monasteries, ensured the survival of written culture. Everything I'm referring to today in this lecture is based on manuscript sources, and those manuscripts come from the only people who still knew how to read and write, and these were monks. Let us turn to the second page, where you have a map telling you exactly the same story I have been narrating. So those Anglo-Saxon invaders coming from the shores of Denmark and northern Germany, landing first on the east coast of England, and then rolling back the Celts all the way to Wales, to some extent to Cornwall. Some of them crossed over to French Brittany, and of course up the Pennines, up north to where the Picts and the Scots lived, the Scots of course having given their name to Scotland. Again, remember, Ireland remained untouched. Those Anglo-Saxons were of course pagans. They worshipped the gods of the Norse pantheon. I suppose you know about it to some extent. The main god was Odin. The English form is Woden, and they led a life of near permanent warfare. From the Eddas, which is probably the only large, extensive written document we have about their civilization, what the Eddas are is explained in the footnotes, we can gather that the cliches were true. They spent their lives fighting, and their idea was to die fighting in order to go straight to Valhalla, where they would enjoy permanent feasting with plenty of beer and mead until the end of the world, the Ragnarok. Now, we're more interested in the language itself. The language they spoke was derived from Common Germanic. I'm giving you all the details if you're interested there. This language later stabilized as what we know to be Old English, OE, also known as Anglo-Saxon. That's the same. And this is the language of the texts we are interested in, those of this first period, going roughly from the middle of the 7th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. Of course, they did not use the Latin alphabet at first. All they had was, by way of an alphabet, was the use of runes, carved runes. This was the so-called Futhark alphabet. The name derives from the first runes in the list, so I'm giving you a chart here. Okay, of course, the Latin alphabet was ill-adapted to render this Germanic language. Some of the sounds were missing. So when, after a while, those Anglo-Saxon invaders adopted the Latin alphabet, they had to include a few special letters for special sounds that were not initially included in the alphabet. So we find in those manuscripts, we find runes, in fact, letters that are derived from runes. The classic ones are the Thorn letter for the initial TH, and F for TH sounds in the middle or final position. Now, those Anglo-Saxon invaders were a bit like the Celts. I just mentioned it, they loved fighting. So after having conquered the country, of course, they did not unite. They created roughly 7 kingdoms, which for centuries kept fighting each other, basically. So this is also known as the Heptarchy period. From Greek, of course, 7 kingdoms. Mercia, Wessex, Essex, Sussex, East Anglia, etc., etc. Now, some kings attempted to unite all of this, and in the end they sort of succeeded, but sometimes unity lasted for only their lifetime and then it collapsed again. So what we have in terms of written productions is typical of a time of trouble. We only have chronicles, that is, people trying at least to keep a record of what was going on. Facts, dates, battles, names of kings and queens. And poetry, from short riddles to large narrative poems. And even after the adoption of Christianity by those Anglo-Saxon, you can still see in those texts that fate is still the governing notion. In fact, there was more violence when something happened to the Anglo-Saxons quite similar to what had happened to the Celts. They too suffered invasions from their cousins, Vikings, from Denmark and Norway, roughly from 840 onwards, started to do landings on the east coast and then settling and then trying to conquer the whole land. Of course, this meant fighting. These Vikings were definitely pagan, and they despised those Anglo-Saxon cousins who had converted to Christianity. So they did not hesitate to burn, kill, plunder, annihilate everything. Good example, 869, they completely ravaged East Anglia. They took the last king, Edmund, tied him to a tree and shot him full of arrows. He was therefore made a martyr by the church, and where the body was found, they created the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. That's obvious. Now, this situation lasted on and off almost until the Norman conquest. Sometimes great Anglo-Saxon kings managed to almost unite the land and repel the Vikings. That was the case with the great Alfred. But even Alfred the Great had to, by treaty, acknowledge that some areas of the land would not be under the laws of the Anglo-Saxons, but still under so-called Dane law, the law of the pagan Danes, the Vikings, basically. Now, even a few weeks before the Battle of Hastings, when King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king, was defeated by William the Conqueror, well, Harold had been fighting some Norwegian landing up north, you see. So all the way to the end, this situation of violence lasted. What we have in terms of written production is typical of a time of not only absence of reading and writing, I told you about that, but also permanent violence and the fight between two layers of culture and civilization. On the one hand, Christianity. On the other hand, paganism. On the one hand, an attempt to restore a settled life based on agriculture. On the other hand, a life of unsettled permanent warfare. And the two cultures, more or less, coexisting side by side or blending. This is obviously what you see in those texts. What do they look like? Before we move on to poetry, I wanted to show you a first text excerpt. There you have it. This is the Lord's Prayer in Old English. Now, if you've studied German, it would be pretty easy for you to find your way about because it looks like German. If you haven't done any German, I would definitely have to explain. So, as you can see in this text, we have the runes I've mentioned. Vader ure, thou art in heaven, siehe den Name gehalgot. You see, Vater unser, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. To become din reiki, thy kingdom come, geworde din villa on erdan. Thy will be done on earth, swaswa on heaven as it is in heaven. This is why when you have those old English texts published nowadays, they're always published as modern English translations. Otherwise, most people wouldn't be able to follow. You might pick up a few words, but frankly, if you don't know German, that would be very difficult. For instance, you have a particle for the past participle, gehalgot. You see, this has completely disappeared from modern English, so most people would be able to understand. So below you've got the opening lines of Beowulf, but of course you have, in order to understand it, you need a modern English translation. Right, so now let us have a look at poetry. Obviously, it's no wonder that the first monuments of English literature should be full of seafaring adventure, monster slaying, and bloody fights. The first and most important text is the famous Beowulf. That's a long, anonymous poem of more than 3,000 lines belonging to the epic genre. We have a manuscript dated from the 10th century, but it was probably composed in the 8th century. In this poem, we have, of course, pagan culture side by side with Christianity. The text is very, very famous. It has been translated time and time again into modern English, for instance, in the 20th century by Tolkien and by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. It's definitely a must-read. If there is only one book you should read for this first period, it's definitely Beowulf. I won't tell you the whole story, but I can try and summarize it. It tells the story of a hero, of course, a Geatish hero. That would be, okay, let's call that Swedish Goth. Okay. The hero's name is interesting. It's probably Beowulf. It's typical of pagan culture where warriors try to associate with animals in order to acquire their qualities, the strength of the bear, maybe the cunning of the wolf, something like this. Now this hero, this totemic hero, is going to offer his services to a king, King Hrothgar, whose kingdom is ravaged by a monster. This monster is Grendel, and in fact he's got a mother who is even worse than him. Actually, Beowulf, they kill people, they ravage the kingdom basically. Beowulf will kill both after an epic series of fights, of course, but sadly 50 years later in his own kingdom he will die fighting a large sea dragon. Right. What does it look like? Well, again, I have provided text excerpts. Let's see. These are the opening lines. Attend, we have heard of the thriving of the throne of Denmark, how the folk kings flourished in former days, how those royal athelings earned that glory. Athelings were sort of royal princes. You see, attend, quit, means basically shut up, I'm going to start the poem, because of course this poetry is oral. I'll explain that in a moment. If you're interested in hearing those opening lines in the original Anglo-Saxon or Old English, I have included here a link to a YouTube little snippet where a professor, much better than I do, will give you a rendering of what it must have sounded like in Old English. Okay, in the Book of Exeter, which is the most famous manuscript collection we have of Anglo-Saxon poems, we have shorter versions of the same. The Seafarer, for instance, and the Wanderer, they evidence the same blending of cultures. Memories of the pagan past and Viking life fused with newly acquired Christian feeling. So those poems are somehow documents of how this subgroup from the Germanic family gradually became detached, moving away from a life of warfare to a life with less glory, of course, but much needed order, peace, civilization in the richer, more fertile land of England. I said this poetry was mostly oral. That's a fundamental characteristic. And there are a few key notions you have to know about it. Since very few people could read and write, mostly clerics, a few aristocrats, but even then they were considered as eccentrics when they were interested in knowing how to read and write. For example, King Alfred the Great had a library, and he was considered a bit of a nerd for that. So there was a monopoly of reading and writing assigned to clerics. But even before conversion to Christianity, poetry had always been limited to a specific class, subgroup of people. In this Norse, Nordic, Germanic world, the poets were a small bunch of people known as the skalds. The Anglo-Saxon equivalent would be the skops, possibly pronounced shops, very much connected to religion. A poet in those days was very close to a priest, a seer, a shaman. Moreover, they were using runes, and runes could be used for magic and foretelling the future. So writing poetry was a near religious magical activity, something very, very serious. It was highly codified, and among the various rules there was the necessity to use a very, very special language, including special words that would replace the normal words. These are known as the Haiti. More common set phrases replacing the normal words. These are known as kennings or kenningar. This is something typical of Anglo-Saxon poetry. You really have to know about it. I'm giving you here a few examples, including one or two from Beowulf. For example, in Beowulf, the sea is referred to as the whale road. Kind of logical. Blood is battle sweat. Sometimes it can be rather funny, like the sun being the sky candle. Now, who is the slayer of giants? Well, that's Thor. What are the sea steeds? Well, these are ships. Fairly logical. So we had those shops or scops, also sometimes gleemen, professional reciters who learned the poems by heart and recited them to the benefit of the audience. Well, the audience could be anything from the king and his companions or courtiers. It could be a local lord with his family. It could be a public audience. There were no real castles until the Norman conquest, but still they were burghs, large halls, where the lords of the manor would sit on a dais. That's a far-end platform. Now, even today, if you go to a typical English castle, the first room at the entrance is the hall. Comes from German, die Halle. You see a large room, rectangular room, with a very high ceiling. And originally, the guests would sit around the central fire trench, and the Lord would sit on a platform at the end, at the far end. That's the dais, right? So yes, it had to be oral. It had to be recited aloud. Now, in order to make sure people listen to you when you do that, as I mentioned a moment ago with the beginning of Beowulf, you go, quit, attend, shut up, listen to me. But you also need to make sure your language is heavy, repeated, really, really, really to be heard. This is why the Anglo-Saxons used a specific verse pattern based on the repetition of initial consonants. This is known as the alliterative verse or Stabreim. I'm sending you a special fact sheet on the subject, so I'll show you that. This is a PDF file you'll get. You've got all the details there. But I must mention a number of elements right now. Now, modern English poetry is based on the alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. It also uses devices you can find in other Western forms of poetry, like the use of end rhymes, the use of quantity, that is the alternation of short and long syllables, the repetition of vowels, that's assonance. Plenty of little devices like that. But with Anglo-Saxon poetry, there was no such thing. No end rhymes, No repetition of vowels. Vowels were not really important. There was no numbering of syllables as you have in French poetry, for instance. No, 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 no. It was only about repeating initial consonants. So I'm giving you a sort of description of the pattern here. The lines were very short. They were divided into two segments. And what was important was to repeat initial consonants. So I'm giving you an example here from Beowulf. Tha kom of Mori under mist gledum, Grendel gongen, God's ear bear. Now the first one is not really regular, but you have a repetition of M, okay. But the second one is very regular. It's really in accordance with the Stabreim alliterative verse pattern. You see, Grendel gongen, Goddess ear bear. G, 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 B. Next one. Mintes manskada manakins M, 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 K. Sume beserwan en sele tham hen S, 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 H. You see. So it's not always 100% regular, but usually you can find it, you can spot it when you listen to the lines. To our modern ears, it does not sound really musical, but at least it made sure that people were really, really listening. Heavy repetition of initial consonants. As I said, you can pick up a few words. Tha kom of More, there came from the moor. Grendel gongen, Grendel going. God's ear bear, God's anger bore, you see. But in order to get the real meaning, you have to translate. Coming from the moor, passing under misty hills, Grendel was going, and he carried God's anger with him. This monster hater of men was intended to snatch another man from this magnificent palace. Okay, so try to memorize this. The use of kennings or kenningar, special words, replacement set phrases, the whale rode for the sea, and alliterative verse. What is alliterative verse? You must be able to define that and explain that. Beowulf, I said you should read it, but of course it's not necessarily going to be too pleasant for you. We'll have a look at an excerpt in a moment. But first, just to mention a few other poets, minor poets. We have Cadman, who died around 680. He wrote a poetic adaptation of the Book of Genesis. And we have Kinny Wolf, who lived later in the 8th century. He wrote funny little poetic riddles. We have some 80 of them in the Book of Exeter, and much more serious Christian religious poems. Fates of the Apostles, the Phoenix, etc. He's interesting for having invented, well, you might call that calligraphic games. For example, he's got a poem where each line starts with a letter of his name. Kinny Wolf, okay, he's having fun. So do not imagine these Anglo-Saxon poets to have been only super serious, epic tellers of warfare stories. Sometimes they could be light-hearted, but it's a minority occupation. The majority thing is what you have in Beowulf. So I'll end this section by having a look at a final excerpt from Beowulf I've given you here. So I'm giving you the Anglo-Saxon original. You can try to pick up a few words. Maybe sometimes you will be able to. And of course, on the right, I'm giving you, opposite, I'm giving you the modern English version. I'll go only through the beginning to underline the presence of the two cultures, Christianity on the one hand, and paganism, the pagan worship of violence and warfare on the other hand. So this is about the defeat of the monster Grendel by Beowulf. It was then that this monster, who moved by spite against humankind, had caused so much harm, so feuding with God, found at last that flesh and bone were to fail him in the end. For Hygelac's great-hearted kinsman, that's Beowulf, had him by the hand, and hateful to each was the breath of the other. You see here we have a direct Christian reference. Grendel, just like Satan, just like the devil, hates mankind because he hates God. And that gives you an explanation for his being so evil and snatching people like a serial killer. In a purely pagan text, you wouldn't have that sort of explanation. But then we have the pagan element next. The fight is described in a typical pagan way. A breach in the giant flesh frame showed them, shoulder muscles sprang apart. There was a snapping of tendons, bone locks burst. See the heavy repetition the translator is trying to convey. Bone burst. Beowulf, the glory of this fight was granted. To Beowulf, the glory of this fight was granted. Grendel's lot to flee the slopes fenward with flagging heart, to a den where he knew there could be no relief, no refuge for a life at its very last stage, whose surrender day had dawned. The Danish hopes in this fatal fight had found their answer. You see, the decisive thing is not the intervention of God, and there is no repentance. There is only a final use of violence. And the violence is described in very graphic terms. You've got the tendons slapping, the bones breaking. It's typical of the pagan culture that you should revel in the fight, basically. And somehow the fight is the answer, is the good answer to the hopes of the Danes. The Danes, of course, in the story being the victims of Grendel. Right. If you read the last stanza, you will see again exactly the same thing with this exaggeration. Beowulf tearing up the shoulder and, almost throwing it away. It's almost like a scene from a superhero movie, in a way. So that's Beowulf for you. Again, a must-read for the period. Finally, let us turn to the last section we have to examine on the Anglo-Saxon period. That is monks and their chronicles. Indeed, the second valuable literary legacy left from that period is the work of chroniclers. These were mostly clerics who led a sheltered life. Some actually travelled and even acted as civil servants or diplomats in the service of kings. Their manuscripts are often the single sources for key historical events, but they also give us an insight into Anglo-Saxon culture at large and the minds of men in those singularly tough and troubled times. They, again, provide an account of the gradual blending of paganism into Christianity. Not to mention the preservation of the Latin heritage, the little that was left from Latin. The most famous chronicler is Bede the Venerable, or the Venerable Bede. He was a Benedictine monk from Northumbria who wrote extensively, in Latin of course, about almost every possible subject. He is still revered as the father of English history for his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, 731. This chronicles everything from pre-Roman times to his own present day. Now, in the text samples, I have included two very famous anecdotes which are narrated in the Ecclesiastical History of England. The first one is about Pope Gregory having, maybe you already know about this famous anecdote, having spotted English slaves in Rome. and saying, "Oh my God, they're so beautiful. They're not non-Angli, c'est Angeli." They're not English. They're angels, something like that. And this would have, according to legend, decided Pope Gregory as to sending new missionaries to England to restore Christianity there. The second one is perhaps much deeper and much more interesting. It's the famous sparrow anecdote, in which you have a clear insight into why those pagans so readily adopted Christianity, why they were somehow clueless as to the afterlife and sort of left unsatisfied by their own religion as to what comes in the afterlife. This is very, very interesting. It gives you really an insight into why people change their religion. Now, beside the Venerable Bede, we find people like Alcuin, who is famous for having exercised a great influence on the resurrection of schools and learning in continental Europe. He might be the one responsible for our doing what we're doing today, because of course he was a great friend, became a great friend of the Emperor Charles the Great, Charlemagne, at his court in Aachen, where he somehow fostered the Carolingian Renaissance of culture, including the reorganization of a system of schools. He was also a logician and a mathematician. Sometimes the chronicles are collective and anonymous. For instance, we have an Anglo-Saxon chronicle from the 9th century, which is distributed in terms of manuscripts all over monasteries. Sometimes the manuscript was copied in a certain monastery and the local monks added some sequels. At another monastery they would add a different sequel. So sometimes it's really a bit messy and collective. Finally, somebody I have already mentioned, King Alfred the Great. He was learned himself, and again that was an exception. He encouraged a few decisive things. The first was the teaching of primary education in vernacular Anglo-Saxon, vernacular Old English. He imitated Charles the Great by establishing a model court, which was supposed to be imitated throughout the land. He was very serious about it. He supplied books himself, more exactly manuscripts, by writing a handbook for schools. Well, sadly it's lost. He also translated into Old English a number of key Christian Latin works, including the Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy, or books by St. Augustine or Pope Gregory. He drafted laws, the text of which is always very interesting. Now, after the Norman Conquest, this will be the starting point of our next lecture. We have a persistence of chronicles with, of course, still written in Latin, but sometimes narrating the heroic exploits of, that's anachronistic, but what you might call people resisting the Normans. The most famous of one is the story of Hereward the Wake, the Gesta Herewardii, a Latin chronicle, telling you about a rebel chief fighting the Romans. But basically, after 1066, Old English went into abeyance. It was put on the back burner. I'll explain that in our next lecture. Now, do remember poetry on the one hand, monks and chronicles on the other hand. So what you have to memorize from this first period is fairly limited and fairly simple. Now, at the end of each lecture notes, I always provide film and TV references. These are totally subjective remarks. So this is my advice in terms of film and TV. Feel free to disagree completely with me. I also mention usually a few must-reads. Now, with this first period, the Anglo-Saxon period, there's only one thing you should definitely have read at the end of your first year, and that's Beowulf, of course. Right, so basically that's it. Remember, I'll be sending everything, the fact sheets, the course notes, and of course you have the course brochure coming up.